Okay, the topic is self-imposed limitations. I want to start with 3 puzzles. And the point of presenting them is not so much the answers to the puzzles, but what the 3 puzzles together reveal about something about the way we think about things. They're well-known puzzles. I don't know if anyone will know all 3, but they're pretty well-known puzzles. I'm on one side of a river. I have 3 things with me: a dog, a cat, and a mouse. I have to get them to the other side of the river. My problem is I've got a very small boat. When I cross the river, I can only take one of the 3 with me at a time. Left alone, the dog will kill the cat and the cat will kill the mouse. I don't want that outcome. So how do I do it? How do I get all 3 across with no deaths? So the solution is this. The only one that I can take from the 3 without risk is the cat. The dog will not attack the mouse. The dog will only attack the cat. So I take the cat, the dog and mouse will remain without any injury. Take the cat across. Then I come back and I take the dog across. But now I have a problem, because if I leave the dog and cat on the other side, the dog will kill the cat. So I take the cat back with me. Now on the first side of the river I have the cat and the mouse, and now I take across the mouse and leave it with the dog. And then I come back and get the cat and take it across. The reason people don't think of that is because they think I'm going from side A to side B. So how shall I take from A to B? And how shall I take? And what shall I take? They don't think of taking something back from B to A. And that's where the solution is. That's one example. Now, I have 6 pencils, exactly the same size. I want to use the 6 pencils to make 4 triangles. Each side of each triangle should be a whole pencil. How shall I make 4 triangles out of 6 pencils? Well, the answer is you make a pyramid. Make a triangle on the table like this, and then have one pencil coming up this way, and one this way, and one this way to a point in the center. And then you get the triangle on the table plus 3 bent triangles, and you get 4 triangles out of 6 pencils. It's just that you didn't think of using the 3rd dimension. You thought it should be flat. I didn't say it should be flat. I just said make 4 triangles out of 6 pencils. Here's a similar example.
The mic.
It doesn't work?
No, it works. It just.
Oh, I didn't put it on.
Yeah, sorry.
I forgot to put it on.
That's my.
No, my problem. I usually remember. Okay. So now, I don't think.
Audio though, but yeah.
Let's see. I have. Nine dots, making a rough square. Now the idea is to join all the dots with 4 lines without taking the writing instrument off the board. In other words, put it down and make 4 lines without picking it up, so the lines are all joined, connected, and join all 9 dots. So the way you do it is like this. Clever, hey? Didn't pick up my hand. 4 lines. Oh, but I went outside the perimeter of the 9 dots. But you don't think of that. You think, oh, how do I fit it in? And if I curve it here, then it's going to miss that one, and I can't go around. But nobody said that it had to be within the perimeter of the 9 dots. I didn't say that. What stops people from solving problems like this is that they intuitively add conditions to the problem, which aren't stated in the problem. And then, with those intuitively added conditions, the problem is insoluble. You can't make 4 triangles with 6 pencils where each triangle has a leg, a whole pencil, flat on the table. You cannot do that. But you can do it in 3 dimensions. Yeah.
The problem that a lot of the time these riddles imply the limitations, but the limitations aren't really there.
Nothing in the words that I said imply at all any of the limitations. I said take 6 pencils and make 4 triangles. That implies it's got to be flat? Mapito. Right? I said join them with 4 lines. That implies that the lines have to be within the space of the 9 dots? Not at all. I said get them across the river. I didn't say only with trips going from A to B. I just said get them across the river. And nothing in the words imply the limitations. The question will be, well, where do the limitations come from? I think the knee-jerk response to this idea is that, well, get rid of those limitations. Look how they're crippling you. What I want to do is I want to criticize that response. I don't think that response is correct. I think the situation is a little bit more subtle than just, well, don't have any limitations. There's a second idea which is, I think, somewhat similar. Let's think about stereotypes. People most often condemn stereotypes, especially if you treat someone according to a stereotype and it doesn't fit. Treat people as they are. Treat them for what they are individually. To stereotype people is to impose upon them a false frame, as the psychologists would say, or a false interpretation, and may blind you to being aware and sensitive to the unique characteristics that they have. Don't use stereotypes. Really? I'm going to go and spend 2 weeks in Italy. I've never been to Italy before. Should I read a travel book which describes Italy? Probably it won't only describe the mountains and the subways, it'll also describe the people. This is what Italians are like. Don't read that book. Don't read it, because you'll be using a stereotype and you won't be able to see people's individual differences. Well, it's true. If I use a stereotype, I might not be able to see people's individual differences. But is it possible that knowing a stereotype of Italian people could help? Is it possible? Something which applies to, let's say, 90% or 80%. If you walk into a shop, if you ask for information, if you ask for directions, not to know what to expect? Surely there are stereotypes. Stereotypes grow not because they're basically accurate. Imagine the question, if I walk into a shop and the shopkeeper starts a conversation, how should I respond? In some places, it'll be perfectly all right to say, sorry, I'm in a hurry, see you another time. In other places, that'll be a great insult. Don't you want to know beforehand whether it's acceptable to cut it off or whether you're insulting the person that you're talking to? Wouldn't that be useful to know? I think that the wise use of stereotypes is to know that you need to have stereotypes, and it's appropriate to use them preliminarily, but to keep your eyes open, and to be sensitive to individual differences in spite of the stereotype. Don't discard the stereotype, but don't be a slave to it either. Why do people dress the way they dress? Because they want to provoke a reaction on the part of the person who sees them. And we are all experts at knowing how people will respond if I dress this way or dress that way. in particular if you dress just like everybody else, or differently from everybody else. No, if people know that and they dress for that purpose, then when you see someone dressed that way, it's appropriate to classify him according to his dress. That's why he's dressing that way, because he wants you to classify him that way. It's just that, as I said, sometimes you have to be very careful about the stereotype. Now I want to move to something a little more contentious and a little more practical. Somebody's opinion is quoted about a certain subject. How do you make up your mind how much credibility to give that person? It may be in a news source or from a friend. It might be important for you to have some information about the subject. How do you decide whether to trust him or not? Well, of course, you use stereotypes. You don't know the guy, and you're not going to know the guy. You want to know what his academic credentials are? You want to know what he does for a living? You want to know what experience he has? And that will give you a good reason to decide whether or not to give him credibility. Doesn't mean that it can't be corrected. It certainly can be corrected. In many cases, you need to correct it. But starting from there, you shouldn't say, well, I don't know him personally, so I don't know what to think. You have some information, and you can rightly use that information to in my field in philosophy, I know, in terms of books, the two best publishers are Harvard and Oxford. They publish the best books. Some of them are flubs. Some of them are losers. No doubt, no question that happens. But on the whole, so if I know that this book is published by Harvard University Press, I have a good reason to think that it's a good book. That's a stereotype, and it's correct. Of course, I'll keep my eyes open, especially if it's in my field, to see whether the guy really did a good job or not. There are places where they don't. So when we talk about self-imposed limitations, some people hear that, this is roughly what I meant, they're limitations you put on any investigation which guide you in how you structure the investigation. The examples of the riddles that I gave you show you how these self-imposed limitations can cost you the right answer. That's true. But the solution to that is not to discard self-imposed limitations. It's two things. Number one, well, maybe three. First of all, be aware of them. And second of all, at least sometimes, to some extent, ask yourself, where is this initial orientation that I'm taking with me coming from? And investigate whether it's an appropriate orientation. And thirdly, be prepared to discard it when the circumstances require. Here's a very famous example. Einstein took a position at a particular time, and later he called it the worst mistake of his career. Others disagreed. They thought he made worse mistakes. But this is what he thought. When he published general relativity, the equations that govern the structure and the development of the universe, he noticed that according to his equations, the universe as a whole wasn't stable. In particular, the universe as a whole could grow or shrink. Grow or shrink? The whole universe? Come on. That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. So he changed the equation. He put in something called a cosmological constant, which keeps the cosmos constant. That's what it does. Makes sure it doesn't grow, doesn't shrink. 1928, 29, when Hubble started publishing his results that the stars are receding from us, the galaxies are receding from us, and looks like the universe is expanding, Einstein said, I could have predicted that. If I had trusted my own equations, I could have predicted that. Predicting that light is bent by the sun is nothing compared to predicting that the universe is expanding. That would have been absolutely gigantic. Why did he do it? Because all observation and all history of observation was that the large-scale universe doesn't change. It doesn't change. It's always exactly the same. The stars are there, and the sun is there, the moon is there, and the comets are there, and it doesn't change. That's something he brought with him to his investigations. He didn't learn it from, he brought it with him. And have something that goes against it, he stared at it and he blinked. And he himself said, had I been willing to follow my equations, I would have been able to predict it, but he wasn't able to. This is a problem in science a lot of the time. Science has a certain methodology. Thomas Kuhn, whose conclusions I don't agree with, but talked about the paradigm of science, of scientific revolutions, and this description of having certain criteria that you bring to the investigation, and you use that as your guide as how to conduct the investigation and how to evaluate the results, is definitely a good example, a description of what people do. Whether you can escape it and whether you're a prisoner of it, and so on. That's the deeper philosophical. I'm not going to that. But that's what they definitely do. And revolutions take place when it's discovered the paradigm can't work anymore. To replace it with another paradigm. It's a gigantic conceptual shift in the way in which people think about the universe. Science has both features. Using the paradigm is important because it organizes and focuses research, and it gives you a way of understanding and evaluating the results that you get. And when you're doing what he calls normal science, it's very productive. You develop a lot of material, a lot of understanding. You often have certain puzzles, which are outliers, like the precession of the perihelion of Mercury. Mercury doesn't move exactly right, according to Newton. It just didn't do what Newton said it should do. Okay, so, it's a problem. It's got lots of other things that do what Newton said. So let's work with them and, think about this. Maybe we'll figure out a solution. The solution was to junk Newton for Einstein. So here too, noting that having the paradigm and using the paradigm blinds you to certain types of developments is not a reason not to use a paradigm. It's a reason to use it and be careful and try to, when you're faced with something extraordinary, to be able to think outside it. I like to compare Mercury with Neptune. Neptune also didn't move the way it should move according to Newton. This was the 19th century. So what to do, So some people actually suggested, well, maybe Newton's laws aren't always right. Most people did not want to take that seriously. Some people did a very gigantic, brilliant, beautiful calculation. They said, listen, Neptune's out there, it's not moving right. Maybe there's something else out there that we can't see yet, haven't discovered yet, and it's close enough to Neptune to interfere with the way Neptune is moving. And then Newton's right, it's just that something else is there that's distorting the gravitational field at that point and making it move differently. Now they calculated where it should be, when, to have that effect. That's astonishing. Out there, at that distance from the Earth, you have billions of miles. They located it exactly where it has to be. And they said to astronomers, point your telescope at that place at that time, and you'll see a planet. And they found it. That's astonishing. That's astonishing. They're the conservators who are holding on to Newton, won the day very effectively. Having done that, and having discovered that Mercury's not moving right, there was a gigantic search for another thing hiding in there, which is distorting Mercury's. The trouble is they didn't find anything. And when Einstein, who has laws different from Newton's, when he calculated how Mercury moves, and he discovered that he got it right, Einstein got something right that Sir Isaac Newton got wrong. Can you imagine how he felt? His theory got it right. So it's this joint paradigm that a person has to have in looking at the world, and using stereotypes or using the tools that you have, that you bring to investigations, is not a wrong thing to do. Now, I'll show you where you'll discover this. You're very young. Maybe this has happened to you, maybe not. But I know that it happens to older people. you sometimes see older people doing something and you say, wait a second, he's trying to accomplish this and he keeps doing it that way. That way's not going to work. It's the wrong method. And yet he keeps it up. Now why does he do that? Is he just blind? The answer is, the method he's using over here is a method which he's been using for 50 years, and it's a good method. It works a lot. It's very reliable. It's just in this case, it doesn't have to be the right method. He's not blind, he's not superstitious, he's not a fool. He's using a very successful method. Like Einstein used a very successful method that had been working correctly for thousands of years. So when you want to deal with a person like that, the first thing you want to say to him is, I regard you as an intelligent person, a skilled person, a knowledgeable person. I regard your life skills as excellent life skills. I just want to point out the skills that you are using in this particular case don't happen to be the right skills. And you have to think that way also about yourself. Now, sometimes you learn new criteria about what stereotypes to use. There is a very widespread stereotype that being a successful scientist, especially a theoretical scientist, is the top of the intellectual ladder, and these people are brilliant and objective and reliable, and they have the best opinions really about everything. When I was at Hopkins, we had a guy in the physics department who discovered a particle. In those days, that was a big deal. Discovered a new particle. Even got into the New York Times. So the student newspaper interviewed him for his views on religion. Really? Views on religion? And they printed the interview, and we in the philosophy department, somebody put it up on the bulletin board with a sign, see how many mistakes you can find in this. It was childish. And an intelligent 13-year-old could have done better. Why? Because, I hope this doesn't hurt you too much, I break this to you, he's a physicist. Why would you expect him to know about religion? You wouldn't expect him to know about macrobiotic cooking, would you? Well, maybe you would. I don't know what your expectations are. But one thing you need to do, if you're going to worship academic credentials, is at least check the credentials for what subject they qualify the person. And here, it requires a little bit of subtlety. Suppose a scientist, a famous research scientist, tells you about how science is done, the method of science. I say, if he's successful, a successful research scientist, he certainly must know the method of how science is done. Yes, but there's a difference between knowing the method on the one hand, and on the other hand, being able to describe the method in an accurate, coherent way. That's a separate task. It's a separate expertise. He knows how to apply the method. He knows how to do it. That doesn't mean he can explain it. The method of science is really a philosophical subject. Stephen Hawking was proud of the fact that he was part of a philosophical movement which, by the time he was doing his research, was dead. Logical positivism. He didn't know anything about philosophy or science. He did science, but he wasn't trained in explaining science, which is a separate discipline. If that sounds a little too abstract and subtle to grasp, let me give you a very simple example. The best sports performers aren't coaches. The fact that you are the best lacrosse player or the best gymnast doesn't mean you're the best teacher of gymnastic. No. Practicing a particular skill and teaching the skill are different skills. So now, when somebody tells you about the nature of his, I learned this many years ago when I decided to read in psychology. I read a number of books by famous psychologists. Well, I'm a philosopher and a logician. I was very sorely disappointed. I could find contradictions easily. The definitions were not clear definitions. The material wasn't organized well. And I began to wonder, like, why are they so famous? So actually my brother said to me, you're making a big mistake. They're famous psychologists because they work with people and cure them. They aren't trained to write books about working with people and curing them. They're not trained to write books. They're not philosophers. They're psychologists. They know how to do it, but they don't know how to explain how to do it. Those are two different things. It comes out that when you talk about a person's credentials, which would give him credibility, you have to be very, very careful. I had correspondence at one time with a scientist, Israeli scientist, who questioned what I had said about the nature of quantum mechanics. And he was a very eminent scientist. I don't know, he published 60 books and he edited another 100 books and he wrote 500 papers. He was very, very eminent scientist. What he wrote was shtuyot, was nonsense. I finally sent him quotations from Stephen Hawking and from Brian Greene, from another scientist which said what I was saying. Didn't convince him. Then I looked up his record. He's a very eminent applied scientist. He builds things, does experiments, builds technology, and so forth and so on. But he wasn't into theoretical science. So he didn't understand it. He just didn't understand it. So within science, you have different specialties. And the fact that a person is eminent in science, first thing you have to ask is, what specialty is he eminent in? And recognize that his reputation fits only there. Okay, let's go back to what I said before about Hopkins, and now let's look at a whole literature that has come into existence in the last 20 years or so, the new atheists. You have a person who's an outstanding scientist and writes a book about religion. It sells. They're bestsellers, especially because it's knocking religion. And the guy has a big scientific reputation. So you say, you know, Schrodinger is against religion. But when you read it, if you know anything about religion, the guy is totally ignorant. He just doesn't know what he's writing about. You can tell it from the footnotes. He doesn't have footnotes to the classics of religion. He just puts his arguments on the basis of what he's heard on, seen in Wikipedia or seen on websites. So why would you trust a scientist to give you a rational view of religion if he hasn't been trained in it? And now, to be honest and fair, I will say the exact same thing if a rabbi is writing about science. That's why when I talk about science, I do it by quotations. Only when I talk about philosophy of science, because I'm a trained philosopher, and I did publish a book with Oxford University Press, I feel that I have a right to an opinion on that subject. That's my expertise. But I talk about what's going on in science, I read the books that the best scientists write, and I quote them. So if you're looking for a well-informed opinion, a reliable opinion on the relationship between science and philosophy, what do you need to look for? You need to look for somebody who knows both. That's the ideal. Someone who's well-trained, well-versed in both science and religion. There aren't a lot of those. There aren't a lot of those. Even in philosophy, I picked this up when I started to become religious. What's called in Western philosophy of religion, is philosophy of Christianity, because that's the only religion they're familiar with. Yeah, they may read up a book on Buddhism or something, but the only one they're familiar with the concepts, with the practices, with the whole culture, is Christianity. When I read philosophy of religion, I thought, but this has nothing to do with me, because I'm practicing the Jewish religion. I thought, well, wait a second. They're coming from where they're coming. They're treating the religion as they know it. And, so you have to be very careful not to take it as philosophy of world religions, but philosophy of the religion that they know. This idea of expertise is very, very hard. Now, I tell you, if you're looking for dual expertise, which should give it much more credibility, the vast majority, and maybe all, in the case of Judaism, of people who are familiar and knowledgeable in Jewish sources, and also familiar and knowledgeable in scientific sources, are religious Jews. Too bad for the critic, because usually these people are people who were trained in the sciences first and then became religious. That's how they got both. You have some, but it's quite rare for someone who's well trained in Jewish sources from youth to become really solid in a scientific field. And of course, even they are going to be, on the whole, religious. So if you do use dual expertise as the stereotype, the stereotype where you give credibility, so then that's going to, I think, overwhelmingly give credit to the idea that sometimes there's no conflict between Judaism and science, and where there is conflict, there's very good reason to take the Jewish position. But without that appropriate stereotype of demanding dual expertise, then you'll get misleading statements from both sides. I will agree that there are some rabbis who write about science in an irresponsible way, without having first-hand knowledge, without limiting themselves to quotations, which would help anyway, because you have to, even quotations, you have to know when the quotation is relevant and what to draw from the quotation, but still, it would help. You have to be very suspicious. Use your stereotype to be very suspicious of books written by people who are only trained to one side. Now, again, another thing which I've learned, maybe it was only about 5 or 6 years ago. I read an article by someone who I forget that made a very interesting point, and I think this is important to share with people. This fellow was writing about some subject or other which was important for him to know. And it's a controversial subject. And he said, I'm not trained in the subject. And I'm not going to get trained in the subject. So I asked myself, how could I evaluate in any way the different sides of the controversy? He says, I'm not trained in the subject. And he said, I decided to try to understand their values and their priorities from the way they write. For example, do they treat their opponents with respect? Do they speak only about the subject, or do they descend to ad hominem attacks about the other people? Do they ever admit that they're wrong? Do they ever admit that there's something that they don't know? They're still open for discussion, open for investigation? Are they always positive and always surely right about everything? Do they ever engage in debates with people on the other side? Open debates? You use those criteria and you will find often that whole positions are sharply distinguished by those criteria into better and worse. In my experience, the debates about evolution, although there are weak players on both sides, but those who are fighting, let's say, with intelligent design, those who are supposed to be representing evolution, are failures on every count. They purposely misunderstand and misdefine the position of the other side. They accuse the other side of cheating and lying and incompetence and foolishness and so forth and so on all the time. They will not debate. They certainly will not debate. And they never admit that they're wrong. Never. And they're absolutely sure, absolutely certain what they say is correct. To me, that's very untrustworthy. It's very untrustworthy. By the way, I read in evolution, and there's a certain style in a book. The book says, up until now, there's been this barrier to the success of evolution, but we have a solution. Okay? Now you look at the up until now. Up until now, Q has been in the way, and then do a search for Q. See whether it's been mentioned before. Never. It's not in the literature. Because it was hiding. Because they don't want you to know that something's there. They only present a problem when they have a solution. They won't present a problem before they have a solution because it makes it look bad. It makes it look like you don't know something. when you see that kind of cheating going on, you think, I can't trust these guys. And that is quite correct. You can't trust these guys. Now, this really is found in an essay by Rabbi Destler, where he makes the following general remark. The essay is called something like The Nature of Musar, because he thinks that Musar is a program for finding the truth by improving your objectivity. He says, every moral failing implies an intellectual failing. Indeed, every moral failing implies that you have some characteristic that compromises your objectivity. Now, you know, I spent a lot of time in university, in philosophy. Never did I hear that credibility might depend upon moral character. You can guess for yourselves why I never heard it, considering, like, you know, people who are involved in this discipline. Let's take some examples. Let's take laziness. Who's just lazy? Let's suppose an issue requires a thorough, large, long-standing investigation. 6 months. A lazy person is not going to have the strength to finish it. At a certain point, he's going to call it off and say, okay, I've been in this for 4 months, forget it. I have enough information, I have enough background, I'm going to draw my conclusion and go on to something else. Yeah, but you didn't finish the investigation. So then, your conclusion isn't objective. As objective as it could be. I shouldn't speak as if there's objective or not. But if you had surveyed more of the information, maybe you would have seen it differently. So the moral weakness of laziness will lead to a lack of objectivity. Similarly, Destler takes this from the Maharal, similarly, a premature conclusion. Drawing, a week of investigation, the reporter says, it's Tuesday afternoon. How's it going? How does it look so far? Oh, this is, the New York Times. They're going to put my name on the front page. I got to tell them how it looks so far. That's right, you certainly do. And then the rest of the week, you're going to be defending that because you took it as a position. You knew there were 2.5 days of investigation to go? Yeah, you knew it. But your psychology doesn't respond to what you know. So listen to a law of Jewish jurisprudence. The judge is going to hear a case between Reuven and Shimon at 3 o'clock. What's going to happen is Reuven is going to present his position because he's his first speaker, according to the law. And then Shimon will present his position. Reuven's there at 3 o'clock. And at 5 to 3, Shimon says, I'm stuck in traffic. I'll be there by 3:20. The judge says, well, okay, but I mean, Reuven's going to speak first anyway. So let's have Reuven speak, and when Shimon comes in, he'll speak. No, you can't do that. Verboten. In Jewish law, you're not allowed to do that. I'll explain it because think of the difference. The judge is sitting there, and Reuven is speaking. Reuven is talking about all he suffered and the crimes the other guy committed and how terrible it is. And Reuven is talking, and the judge is listening. Well, Reuven's talking. Reuven's a human being. He's in pain. The judge is naturally sympathetic. Now contrast that with Reuven's talking and Shimon is sitting there and the judge is listening. So the judge is listening to Reuven, but out of the corner of his eye he says, yeah, but Shimon has a story also. Shimon's also here because he's also suffering. So let's see what Shimon's going to say. The presence of Shimon in the room prevents the judge from drawing a premature conclusion on the basis of what Reuven says. So this resistance to giving a premature, to jumping to conclusions, right? Jumping to conclusions is a terrible fault. In science especially, it's a terrible fault. This will lead, of course, to a lack of objectivity. Now let's take humility. Humility. Well, I made a discovery. I did the experiment, I did the equations, I thought it through and I made the discovery. I'm going to know a Nobel Prize for this. George is criticizing my discovery. He's costing me the Nobel Prize. I can't credit George. I can't take George seriously. because he's threatening my accomplishment. It is known that there are journals whose chief editor is one of the leaders in the field, and he only publishes papers that support his position. He won't publish papers that criticize his position. That's terrible. That's terrible. One of the tests of objectivity is what's called intersubjectivity. You try out the idea on other people and see what they think. If you're looking at something, you ask them for their report. What do they see? So you check what you see. If you are guilty of pride, if you have no humility, you can't do that because you can't credit anybody else's opinion. Then you lose this check on subjectivity, which is intersubjectivity. You lose that because you can't credit anybody else's point of view. So now, in your stereotype for credible scientific opinion, an element ought to be the general moral characteristics of the researcher. As I said at the beginning, stereotypes are starting points, and you may have times when they can be overcome, and you may have to step outside them. But it's definitely a relevant starting point. I sat at a conference, in a national conference in philosophy. Papers were being presented on the work of a certain philosopher. And the way it's done is the paper is presented, and then there's someone who replies, and then there's a discussion. So the GOM, the grand old man, was there, and the guy was reading the paper critical of him, and the commentator was waiting for his turn, and the GOM was saying to the commentator, "Get him! Get him here! Get him here! This is where it is! Shoot him down over here! Get him!" I thought to myself, what's going on? It's a conference of philosophy. Really? Get him? Whew, boy, it was like Roman gladiators, you know. It was. I thought to myself, how could you trust this man? In other words, don't trust. Of course, if he puts forth an argument and the argument works, of course you credit it, no question about it. But don't trust him. There was a style in philosophy when I was doing my work of being cute, writing with in-jokes that only the very clever insiders would get, so that it's like it became an elitist thing. And, she didn't get the joke, so golly, you're not smart enough to get the joke, so you don't belong in the club, and that sort of thing. They outgrew that. The last 30, 40 years, I haven't seen people writing like that. But I think that was... So then you craft what you say, and you craft the idea such a way that it's only for the in-group, and you make sure that it's cutting in a way that... What's that got to do with the truth? What's that got to do with understanding? So this person has an agenda in addition to truth and understanding. Okay, it's good to know. It's good to take into account. People have learned from politicians to check the funding of the group that presents the results. Funding certainly creates a prejudice. That has become also part of the stereotype. I don't know whether people were so aware of that 50 years ago. At any rate, so this is the double agenda. Double agenda is, well, several steps. First of all, to recognize what stereotypes you're using. Second of all, to think, sometimes anyway, about the foundation of those stereotypes. Where are they coming from? What's their claim to fame? And then, thirdly, when you go into a subject, and you're using the stereotypes, be conscious of it, and then look for places where the stereotype is limiting you, and where there's a certain problem that can't be solved, and then start to think perhaps outside the stereotype. I'll give you one last example. Because of politics, I think it's like accepted. There are rules for dealing with human behavior, human group behavior, the history of nations, the history of cultures, and the development of cultures. And you do it that way for all cultures across the board. In particular, cultural interaction, cultural borrowing, cultural malleability is something that's studied all over the world. And the idea is when two cultures come into contact, they affect one another, especially if one is bigger and more powerful and more widespread, and if the smaller one is dependent upon the larger culture, then of course there's going to be a considerable amount of effect on the development of the smaller culture. You take that stereotype and apply it to Jewish history, and you expect that Judaism has picked up ideas from a variety of places, because we have always been a small population. We've never had a great empire. I know, the empire of David and Solomon. Come on. You're talking about the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Romans. It was small change. So you expect to find, and then when you see similarities, you say, well, of course, the Jews took this from them, the Jews took that from them, and the Jews took that from them. Now, stereotypes have to justify themselves. In particular, if you use a stereotype, this is a method, use the method to understand a culture, you have to ask yourself, what does the method predict about how this culture will develop? Well, let's see. If you're talking about cultural malleability, the effect of one culture on another culture, and you know that this particular culture has a small population, and that small population never had an empire, and it's centrally located, as the cliche puts it, at the crossroad of 3 continents, and that many great conquerors marched through their backyard, what would you predict? I think you would predict large-scale instability. There'll be a lot of change, a lot of different development, and if the population became scattered under the influence of different cultures, you would expect the fragments to be absorbed by those cultures. That's what you would expect. But that's not what happened. The stability of Jewish culture is extraordinary, even over the last 2,000 years of scatter. And before that, when we were in our own land, but subject to the Egyptians and the Philistines were next door neighbors, and the Babylonians and the Greeks and then the Romans, the stability of Jewish culture, Jewish ideas, Jewish religion is extraordinary. You had Jews in Yemen for 1,500 years. You had Jews in Poland for 1,000 years. Yemen and Poland are very different. One was Arab barbarian until the Muslim revolution, and then became Muslim, and it's a desert topology together with a gigantic coastline. And Europe is northern, and it's verdant, and it's got virtually no coastline, and it is Poland, I'm thinking of, and it's Christian. If you think that cultures are affected by other cultures and minorities are affected by majorities over a long period of time, there should be nothing in common between Polish Jews and Yemenite Jews. But it's not true. It's just not true. So at this point, I think you have to discard this stereotype. Maybe it works for the Chinese and the Nigerians and the Eskimos. Maybe it does. I don't know. But be a little more open-minded than Einstein and ask yourself, what evidence do I have that it's working? What evidence do I have that it's appropriate? And don't just follow it blindly. If you talk about Jewish history and talk about how different it is for everything else, you'll get a response. No, all histories are the same. All nations are the same. All cultures are the same. They all borrow, they all interact, they all disintegrate. You simply have to say, I'm sorry. You're using a stereotype blindly, and you're not taking into account that the predictions of the stereotype don't hold. So this is a technique you could use with other people as well. Maybe I'll just mention one more example, which I don't know how much I'm repeating myself. When I came to study Gemara, I was using a stereotype that held me back for 5 years. Because I was trained in mathematical logic, that was my field, philosophy of mathematics. These glasses are not stable. They're recycled plastic. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. And one of the stereotypes in mathematics. Okay, thank you very much. There's just over here, there's some more water. Okay, thank you very much. One of the stereotypes of mathematics is you define every concept that you use. You define it. You introduce it by giving a definition. Not only is that a stereotype in mathematics, but I thought, how do you conduct business if you don't define your concepts? I mean, how do you manage to have discussions? I'll never forget, I was sitting in a shiur in Nedarim in Boston, given by a professor of mathematics at Harvard, and he introduced the famous concepts, Isur Chefetz and Isur Gavra, two types of prohibitions. And I said to him, how do you define that? And he said, I don't, and kept going. I thought, what? You don't define them? Where am I? What's going on? It took me years to figure out that Talmud is much more like theoretical empirical science than it is like mathematics. And that being the case, I had to switch my paradigm of how to learn Talmud. Since I had studied some philosophy of science, so I knew something about what to do. But it took me a long time to break my own preconceptions, which I use because they're so powerfully effective for what I'm doing, and say, this isn't the right place to use it. This can happen to people. It can happen in relationships also, it can happen, especially with children. You'll be breaking your stereotypes all the time with children. Yeah.
How do you make the decision that when you find your stereotype has something outside of it, that it's not like, I forget which planet was which, but one planet they actually managed to make it work within the system. They just said there's this outside factor, and when we factor that in, it works. Versus, no, it turned out that the whole system needed to be refined or like changed in a very.
There's nothing you can do but try both. There's nothing you can do but try both. Of course, if you're an individual, then you ask other people. How do you know? Are you familiar with the problem? How do you handle the problem, and so forth and so on. But they searched for an extra planetoid in the near Mercury. They searched for years. That's by far the more conservative solution. So it's much preferable. And then Einstein found it, I would say more or less by accident. He wasn't working on Mercury. He was working on how space-time worked together. And he just took the equation that he got, and then he calculated for Mercury what it should be. It came out right. I can't imagine the thrill that he had at that moment. To have done something which Sir Isaac Newton got wrong, and his theory gets right. And that is really gigantic. So there's no formula which will tell you which one is correct. Now, you have to be open to both. Read around, talk around, see, and then try experimentally on your own. Try to find a local conservative solution, and then try to think about whether there are some weaknesses in your overall paradigm which need to be changed. Okay.